Hello, everybody. It's nice to have everyone together, and I hope that you're safe and keeping busy at home, especially as many of us are homebound. I know that some of you, I recognize the names as fellow JS partners. Welcome as well, and thank you for attending our first JSN webinar. I wanted to first welcome everyone for attending, like I said, our first Japan America Society of Nevada's webinar. Usually our events, as many of yours are as well, are in person, but given what's going on in the world, we're using technology and hosting this via webinar, which is pretty awesome, as we were able to invite people from Las Vegas, but also people from all over the United States, as well as people from Japan. Welcome to all. My name is Rika Tamura, and I am president of the Japan America Society of Nevada. Japan America Society of Nevada started over 20 years ago. Our focus is on building relationships within the community, as well as relationships within Japan, being a resource and hosting events that are educational, cultural, and business related. My contact info will be displayed at the end of today's presentation. Please feel free to connect with me. In attendance with us today is also Mr. Peter Kelly. He is the president of the National Association of Japan America Societies. Including my chapter, there are 38 other chapters throughout the United States. He has been president of National since 2009 and brings a wealth of experience within Japan and the United States in both private and nonprofit sectors. Please welcome Peter Kelly. Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rika, and welcome to all. I see we have 25 participants, which is a terrific start for the new world of online programming. So thanks to Rika for being among the first in the Japan America Society Network to kick off this new technology. Tonight's presentation is part of the Harrison Cook Single Speaker Series, which NAGIS, where I work, exists to create programming opportunities for our member Japan America societies. And this and tomorrow's event in Greater Austin are the two final events this year of the Harrison Cook Single Speaker Series. So we're pleased to have been able to bring those programs to you. Tonight's program is also the beginning of a series of programs offered through Japan America societies on the subject of Japanese consumer opinions during the COVID-19 crisis. Our speaker is Dominic Cotter. Dominic is, as you will shortly find out when he begins to speak, is a graduate of the University of South Wales in Australia. And he's worked in the market research industry in Australia, Japan, and the Asian region for over 20 years. He launched Millward Brown's business in Tokyo in the mid-90s and then founded Cotter Associates, which is now called Cotter JMRN, in 2004. He's experienced in cultural adaptation as well as brand and communication strategy, and he's led a wide range of qualitative and quantitative projects covering customer needs, segmentation, and digital strategy. And tonight's presentation has, I think, two unique elements. One, it's an up-to-date view of how Japanese consumers are reacting during the coronavirus crisis. It also has some local elements that are specific to Las Vegas in relation to the gaming industry. In the presentations, which will come later on in this series in Dallas-Fort Worth and in Georgia and in Los Angeles, there too, local aspects will be part of the presentation. So we'll focus on how Japanese consumers are thinking during the coronavirus crisis. Dominic is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll be open for question and answers. When Dominic gets finished, please be ready either by raising your hand or indicating that you want to ask a question through the chat part of the Zoom network. And we're very pleased to have an expert Zoom controller. Deborah Harlow is in the background making sure that we don't all go off track. With that, Dominic, take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I guess the first point is, everybody, I hope you're all keeping safe. We're all facing a very uncertain situation right now. I'm sure we can all agree about that. In Japan, you know, we went into crisis a little bit earlier than in the US. Peter asked me just to give a current update of how things are tracking in Japan right now. So, of course, last week the Olympics were postponed. This was very big news around the world. But it seems that the postponement of the Olympics has led to, shall we say, a little bit more frankness from the government on the current situation. This time last week, I think people were quite becoming quite blasé about the whole situation. But there was a press conference from Koike-san, who's the governor of Tokyo, last week, and that has led to a definite change in mood. The other thing that's changed the mood of the nation was the very sad news yesterday that very famous talent called Shimura Ken had passed away from the virus. And I think this is having a very significant emotional impact on people. In a practical sense, yes, a lot of people are working from home. A lot of people are still not working from home though, and I think, you know, habits are pretty ingrained, and even in my own office there are people who almost insist on coming into the office, but we have much less people coming in than we did. And also large-scale properties like Disneyland and Universal Studios Japan remain closed, and we don't really know when they're going to reopen. So it's definitely not business as usual, but it's not a complete lockdown as we've seen in other places in the world. So I've got my presentation up on the screen now. The title of the presentation is Adjusting to the Corona Crisis. I think what's very interesting to think about for us in Japan is that this experience that we're going through, and of course not only uniquely going through in Japan, but is that going to actually change what people want, and what type of impact is that going to have in the medium to longer term on consumer behavior and preferences and behavior. Of course, it's still too early to tell, but it just so happened that our annual consumer sentiment survey comes around in March, April. So the timing of the survey is kind of timed for the crisis. Now, just a little bit about myself. As Peter mentioned, I've been working with Japan in Japan since the mid-90s. These days, I have a team of researchers in Tokyo and Osaka. Of course, in the time that I've been in Japan, we have some experience with crises. We're kind of good at crises in Japan. So we had the financial crisis, we had the tsunami. And so we've been through a couple of rounds of disruption. But of course, the disruption that we're experiencing now is quite unique. In terms of an agenda, today I'm just going to take you through the basic objectives and design of our consumer sentiment survey. Then I'm going to talk about what some of the trends that were already in place during the Reiwa era, which is the name of the new emperor ascended the throne last year. It's the name of his reign. Then I'm going to take you through some direct corona crisis impacts and a medium-term outlook in terms of how people are feeling it's going to affect them in the medium term. And then I'll take you through some data on integrated resorts specifically. So in 2017, we started polling Japanese every year in spring. One of the reasons why we did this is we were quite interested in the impact of the new Trump administration on perceptions of America and American brands. It was obviously quite a controversial time. But in general, there was an opportunity for us to put in place some tracking measures year on year on consumer sentiment. So we've been doing that every year since then, and we've just got the data back from our fourth wave, which I'm going to be taking you through today. That fieldwork was done on the 13th to 18th of this month, so it's very recent data. It's a web survey, self-completion. There are 1,000 interviews done nationwide. The sample is population representative between the ages of 15 to 69. And it's, of course, a population representative split of gender. So we had a lot of hope last year with the dawn of the Rewa era. It certainly held the promise of social change and renewal in society. So who knows how significant these turning points really are. But certainly we had that mood, and the change in Japan is really driven by demographics. We're overall dealing with a society with dramatically less people of working age. And that really is what is driving change in Japan. So there's 4 areas. I'm not going to go into them, but there are 4 areas that we generally talk about with regard to these mega trends, if you like, in Japan. So changing world of work. Work is definitely changing in Japan, but it's very, very slow to change. And there's a lot of change that needs to happen for there to be more flexibility, which will help the country deal with the future. Women power is also a very interesting area. Women will increasingly, the participation rate of women is very high right now. The rate of women in management is very low. But over time, we're going to find that women are going to be in a very different economic position and will have genuine economic power. They won't simply be managing the household finances, they'll have their own money. So this is a very, very interesting trend. Generational dynamics, of course, are important. We have a very large aged population, but of course, with the scarcity of young people, it makes what happens with young people to be especially important as well. So the aging story of the population in Japan is not just about the fact that there are a lot of older people, it's that there's actually very few young people, and what is that going to mean? And of course, internationalization. We were experiencing a huge tourism boom in the last few years in Japan, and of course the Olympics, which have been postponed, were going to be a big milestone in that, and we certainly still hope that it will be. Now, we're now looking at some data from our study. So this is a question asking, in order for Japan to remain healthy, its working habits and structure need to change. So last year, which was the first year that we asked this question, we had 59% of our sample saying that yes, they agreed with this statement. Japan needs to change the way that it works. We're now up to 68% this year, which is actually really quite, when you look at this kind of data year on year, this kind of broad kind of social data, this is quite a big increase. And largely it's women that are driving that. In the next chart I'm showing you here, when we ask the question, I feel women are making progress towards equality in society. So last year we had 38% of people saying they felt that women are making progress towards equality. This year it was 41%. So you can see that change is very kind of glacial, or, you know, at least incremental there. And the numbers are quite low as well. So there's a long way to go in terms of gender equality in this market. Just by way of background, what's going on. The Japanese economy has actually been very strong in recent years. So the latest unemployment figure that we had was 2.4% in January of this year. And you can see it's not really that much far above what it was in the early 90s before the bubble burst. So it actually has been quite a good economy from the point of view of employment. And there are more job openings, or there have been more job openings than there are jobs. Now that of course has a lot to do with the fact that the workforce has been shrinking because of the age structure of the population. But nevertheless, if you are working, it has been a good economy for you. And there has been a strong degree of optimism around the Tokyo Olympics here. So we had 55% of people, even in, and we did our survey before the Olympics were postponed as well, but even then we had 55% of people who were saying that they looked forward to the positive impact on the Japanese economy that the Tokyo Olympics will bring. But in Japan, it always seems as though, disaster's around the corner. And I've always felt that I think disaster is sort of part of the psyche of Japanese. It explains to some degree the conservatism that we see here. And we asked this question in our survey this year, to what degree do you agree that disaster is part of life in Japan? And 71% of people said they agree. That disaster is part of life. So people's mindset is generally quite prepared for things to go wrong. Now, specifically on COVID-19, we asked questions that addressed this current issue in our survey, but just to give you a bit of a timeline. So we started to hear a lot about this in this issue in January, of course, and then in early February we had that ship that was docked where the passengers were not allowed off, and then they were allowed off. Then the schools were closed in early March, and the Olympics were postponed last week. So in terms of a timeline, now the numbers of cases, which is the blue bar here, we're looking at around 1,900 cases at the moment. The true number is likely to be a lot higher than that, and there has been some controversy around the levels of testing that have been put in place in Japan, and this is not my area, so I'm not going to comment on it. But you can see that comparing the number of cases in the US compared to Japan, it does look like the situation is not as severe in Japan, but again, there are differing views on that data. We asked questions, general questions about, people's level of concern about various issues. It would seem, certainly when we did the survey, that people's concerns really centered on the economic downturn. So this number here, 56% here, who are very, very concerned. This is relating to the economic downturn. In terms of family well-being here, you can see that's 22% who are very concerned versus 56% who are very concerned about the economic downturn. So it's really more about, okay, the economy's going down, there's going to be restrictions on all kinds of activities, there could be problems in transportation and so forth. People haven't necessarily mapped this onto their job security to the same extent that they're thinking about the economic downturn. But nevertheless, I think that the key concerns that people have now are generally economic. In terms of the impact that people are seeing, 82% are at least seeing some impact, 20% of a major impact. So, of course, the crisis is broadly touching people in Japan as it is in America too. But I mentioned at the beginning, my team and I have been through a number of crises in Japan, and we've seen that Japanese can turn their spending off like a tap. I remember in the financial crisis, it seemed almost overnight, a bunch of restaurants and bars in the area where I lived, basically shut their doors. And so that kind of inherent conservatism kind of clicks on, and people do cut their discretionary spending. So in our survey, we asked about, people's likelihood to increase or decrease their spending in certain areas. So these numbers here that you see are the people who increase subtracted by the number of people who decrease. So it's the net percentage of people who are decreasing or increasing their spending in each category. So dining out, you can imagine there's a big impact on that, and that will be a lasting impact in the next 3 to 6 months. The top number here, 41, is the next 1 to 2 months, and negative 29 here is the next 3 to 6 months. So dining out, group activities, theme parks are taking a hit. I mean, the major theme parks are closed. Some are still open, which is a controversial decision for the parks that are still open, but Disneyland and Universal Studios Japan are closed. Of course, music concerts have an impact, cinema seeing an impact. Also fashion goods. It will be very important for luxury brands to monitor how the way that they're related to by their consumers has changed through this crisis. But definitely people are not going to be buying that many leather handbags and expensive fashion at this point. Taxi rides, we'll see a decrease. Jewelry, household appliances, and relaxation products. So you're a little bit less likely to be going for a massage right now, given the questions that people have. Just one point about questions too. If you do want to write your questions in the chat window, we can address them at the end of the presentation. I apologise, I didn't mention that. So that's where we are seeing people pulling back in their expenditure. They're quite predictable areas. They're discretionary areas, non-essential areas where people are pulling back hard. We asked a question here, is the government giving you enough confidence to maintain your normal lifestyle and spending habits in most areas? Our hope is that the government can kind of help us feel a little bit more confident. But of course, we have almost, about 46% of people, almost half of people saying that they somewhat or strongly disagree with that idea there. So the government has, it's limited, of course, what any government can do in the current situation, but certainly people, are relatively negative on that point. In terms of areas where people's spending is going to increase in the next period, well, of course, face masks. That almost goes without saying, but online shopping, home delivery services, so your Uber Eats, your Demayakan kind of services there, certainly are going quite well. Streaming services like Netflix for entertainment, but of course streaming services for education as well, with having children at home. Ebooks, as you might imagine, video games and esports is an area where it's looking relatively healthy as well. And there are other sources that are basically endorsing that. Supplements, of course, as people look to their health, and skincare is actually looking quite stable as well. So it's not economically, it's not a bad news story for everyone. And those typical areas, and it'll be exactly the same situation in the US, I'd imagine, at the moment. But this is what people are telling us. Now, in terms of the impact on people's personal life in the future. So we have this number of 80 in the next 1 to 2 months from now. We have 80% of people saying yes, it will have a major impact or some impacts. And 3 to 6 months, and then a year from now, we can see that number decreases. But at the same time, that number here in the red down the bottom, the percentage, you cannot predict what that impact is going to be. That is increasing as well, as you might imagine. About in mid-March at least, nearly 70% of full-time workers largely see their working environment as usual. I had said that that habits are hard to break, but in general, work continues. So how is consumer confidence tracking now versus previous years? Every year we ask the question, we've asked this question since 2017. Please indicate how you currently feel about the condition of the Japanese economy. And we measure that for people who say, I'm feeling strongly more positive about it. It's a dynamic question in terms of how they're feeling, down to strongly less positive. So this bottom number here in 2017, 34%, they're the pessimists. 19% here up the top here are the optimists. So you can see throughout the life of our survey, we have more pessimists than we have had optimists. And I think this is an indication of, general conservatism in Japan. Now, 2017, 2018, 2019, the percentage of pessimists has actually been slowly rising, even though the economy has been quite good. And the number of optimists has remained relatively stable, which is kind of like an interesting dynamic there. So good economy, maybe not for everybody, and a conservative situation there. But of course now in 2020, when we've taken our measure, we've got 76% who are, you know, pessimistic about the situation, and only 8% are optimistic. So that's a very large increase, very, very large, like 30 point increase there in that bottom two rating there. So yes, there is a huge impact on sentiment. About the economy, I should say. In terms of my how I currently feel about my own personal prospects regarding the wider economy and my place in it, the results are not quite so dramatic there, but definitely we have, you know, pessimists outnumbering the optimists in 2020 as well. So basically, people can see there are bad things happening in the economy. They're not quite so likely to map that onto their own situation, but certainly looking less optimistic than they were. Somewhat encouragingly, I would say we asked the question here, I feel confident and positive about my future condition in life. So here, really the numbers are not that different year on year, considering the situation we're looking at. So basically people are looking quite you know, okay in terms of the longer term outlook here, which is an encouraging result here. This question that I'm showing you now is asking people, well, what do you think your spending is going to look like 2 to 5 years from now? And again, it doesn't really look like it's not as positive as it was in 2019, but it doesn't look particularly hugely different here. So I think people are able to sort of see the other side of the crisis, and at this point in time, at least, don't feel that it's necessarily going to be a long-term issue. We ask questions every year about how the US is perceived. So, of course, now that we're in a crisis, these numbers are going to be affected by things that the administration in the US is doing. Sentiment about America here, we can see year on year, 2017, 18, 19, 20. We've gone from favourables 31% in 2017, pulled back a bit in 2018, 2019, 35%, 38% in 2020. The reality is that, you know, most people are neutral about the relationship with the US, but certainly many more people are positive about it than are negative. The relationship with the US is not the most important thing for most people. So the numbers appear a little bit modest, but actually have been trending positively, and I think actually look quite good. Perceptions of Trump, something that we've measured, have actually been improving. So we had 54% negatives in 2017, down to 44% in 2020, and 8% positive in 2017 to 16% in 2020. So it's still, you know, Trump's not Japan's favorite American, but basically the perception has been getting better over time. So that's just a quick check in on the political dimension there. Something interesting, of course, is the proportion of people that would like to travel to the US for pleasure. Of course, our measure on business has gone back, but pleasure, you know, we've risen from 52% who were saying that they would very much or somewhat like to travel to the US for pleasure in 2018. That went up to 61% 2019, and 59% in 2020 is pretty stable year on year. So that's a positive result there. Also, in terms of looking at what people's preferred destinations for international travel are, we can see that the US has been actually performing quite well year on year in terms of being a preferred destination for people to travel. So that's also a pretty positive note for the US there. So now I'm going to talk specifically about integrated resorts and what's going on in that sector. We asked a question last year and this year: how familiar are you with the plans for several integrated resorts in Japan? So we've gone from 44% of people saying, I know quite a bit about integrated resort, I know something about it, to 54%. So there has been mass media coverage. There are ongoing discussions in the national parliament. There have been activities and events around it, for example, in Osaka. So we do have an increased level of familiarity among people with the IR project. Now, the level of excitement towards IR, this question says indicate your measure of agreement with the statement, I am excited by the leisure and economic opportunities that casinos and integrated resorts will bring to Japan. So we've gone from 25% who agree on this to 27% this year. So it's not that much of an increase. The people who sort of disagree with that statement have ticked up as well, 4 points. It's relatively stable, but I would say we need to watch the people who are fence sitters on that point. Now is a time when people are going to start to make their minds up. So getting ahead of that, getting ahead of perceptions is going to be quite important if we want them to be, and if we want people to be in that top category and not that bottom category there. And of course, there is work to be done in terms of education on what integrated resort is, what it will mean, and what the benefits will be, especially to the economy. This question here is looking at the importance that they perceive with integrated resorts. So how important is it to you personally that the IR is designed and executed well? So that's gone from 48 to 42 on very important, somewhat important, and it has risen on the not at all, not very important measure. Now, we have to realize, of course, that we're in the middle of a crisis now. So I think it's understandable that the importance that people place on the project is going to pull back. But I think it's also quite likely that as people's focus is we can already see is quite economically driven, and there will be economic issues moving forward, that it may well be the case that the perceptions around the IR do sort of change on this point because the economic imperative will be there. In terms of interest in visiting an IR within 3 hours of travel, we can see that we've still got 10% of people are saying they would definitely visit. We've gone from 29 to 24 in terms of the probablys there. I think again this is because of the current crisis, but we certainly need to make sure that if you do have an interest in perceptions around IR remaining positive, that we get ahead of it and obviously demonstrate what the product itself will be and what the benefits will be from that. And this is a question that we asked last year, looking at what were basically the positives around supporters of IR, and of course the top 2 points are generating tax revenue that will benefit society and bringing economic benefits from increased tourism. So beyond increasing the quality of entertainment and leisure, it really is the economic benefits that supporters cite. In terms of brand awareness of the IR operators, Las Vegas Sands is still the leading brand in the market in terms of awareness. People are generally aware of the Singapore project, MGM followed by MGM and Galaxy, then Hard Rock. In terms of familiarity to the brands, you can see that it has built a little bit for Sands year on year. It has built reasonably strongly for MGM, and Galaxy has pulled back a little bit in terms of awareness, but there is in terms of familiarity, but there is an increased percentage of people who know quite a bit about them. So maybe a result of some focus in the way that they've been approaching their PR. In terms of tips of gaining support for IR, this is this year's measure here. So, of course, you know, we've had a lot of conversation about harm limitation for gambling programs, so that's no surprise there. But communicating more about how the money raised through taxes will be used is important, and providing detailed explanation of plans. So it really comes down to, you know, openness and transparency. And this is a question on transparency that we've asked since 2018, and that's been a consistently strongly endorsed statement here. We need more transparency in our society, including government and business, and that's gone up from 71 to 75% year on year. But it's still, you know, since 2018 has been something that's in strong demand, and some people might argue in short supply in Japan. So that's really really one of the key ingredients of the recipe for success is in IR is transparency. So in summary, short-term confidence is taking a big hit. We can see that come through very strongly in our numbers here. Economically, digital entertainment is a winner. Anything digitally driven, as you can imagine, is going to be doing quite well, and digital is a key platform of everything moving forward. But we can see that, yeah, definitely there are some areas where business is increasing. Medium to long term, the outlook is cautious, but I'd say not overly pessimistic at this point. So if we can keep the issue under control in Japan, I think the outlook is looking quite positive. But it's a very fluid situation right now, and predictions can be dangerous. I do feel strongly, however, that it pays to pay attention to the Reiwa era's long-term trends. So how society changes around the role of women, around work, around aging, and around internationalization. I think these are the challenges that Japan faces, but these are also the opportunities. And then, you know, as I was just saying, transparency and genuine engagement will be a must to maintain trust moving forward for all business, in fact, not just the IR business. So that's all I had planned to present today. I think I'm ready for some Q&A now, if anybody has some questions or comments on anything. So Deb, if you can take that over.
Happy to. We do have some questions that have been submitted here in the chat. The first one here from David says, do you see the telecommuting trend lasting after the crisis ends? And how likely is this a permanent change?
Yes, I think it will be a permanent change. I think people are discovering that they're able to do this. For older people, I think it's more difficult. I've even observed in my own team, you know, the guys that are over 50, they're very ingrained in their habits. But I think we're learning a lot about the fact that we can work from home. We can talk to our colleagues from other locations, but also with clients too. So there's a big ingrained habit in terms of having to go to see clients face to face in Japan, and this has just stopped that. And so I think it won't. We're not going to go fully telework or telemeetings or whatever, but I think there will be a significant increase that's lasting from that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that came in from Paul that says, the hit to the live sports industry has been significant in the US and Europe. How do you see the effect on this in Japan?
Well, it's significant here. We hope it's temporary. So I can't talk about the economic effect that it has on the actual organizations, but I think people are going to want to get back here. I think that people's bias is to want for life to get back to normal. So I think the intent to get back into it is certainly there. That's really as much as I can say.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from Adam. It says, if the view of an activity was already negative, is the population generally more negative on these activities post-COVID, or is the negative perception more general?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I think that if we're talking about like social behaviors as well, or undesirable social behaviors, I think a time like this focuses people's attention on certain things, so it might amplify the way that people feel about things.
Okay, thank you.
And if we can clarify the question, that'd be good. I'm not sure if I understood it.
Okay, I'll keep an eye to see if Adam adds an update. The next question is from John, and it says, when breaking down the data about U.S. opinion, is it consistent across age and gender?
That's a very interesting question. It's actually very younger people are much more positive than older people. I'm talking about people in their late teens and early 20s compared to people who are over 50. And it's really, it actually is very interesting to see that there is a lot of, I think there's a lot of positivity among younger people in Japan. I think that's something to build on.
Okay, thank you. I got a question from Steve that says, were you surprised at the lack of lift in terms of views towards IRs?
Well, familiarity has risen. I think the current crisis really recontextualizes everything in terms of like the importance that people place on the project. So I think I actually think we need to take another measure in 6 months to have a look at that. So I think just when you're really concerned about a whole lot of different things, just down the sort of the order of importance, I think IR has been sort of pushed down there. But I do suspect that as the focus will become very, very, there is going to be a difficult economy, it looks like, coming out of this, that the economic benefits of IR are really going to become more relevant. So I'm not completely surprised because we're in a very unusual situation, but I think we probably need to take another measure of this maybe 6 months time from now, just to see how that has played out. And I think the way that people behave through the crisis will have a big impact on this too, and how they communicate through the crisis.
Thank you. We have a question from David. It says, as you noted, Japan has a large depopulation occurring. Given the choices to increase workers divided between women, robots, and non-Japanese, which do Japanese most prefer in order?
Well, I think people are looking towards the low-hanging fruit in the labour force is women and increasing the role of women. But there are a lot of barriers to that happening successfully. There are certainly a lot of very progressive companies in the space. So, and of course, international companies have less problems, I think, changing than do domestic Japanese companies. But I think people change as a result of necessity, and all of the changes that we see in the Reiwa period, or in the current period, are driven by necessity. So I think that certainly, women are the easiest element in the labour force culturally to increase their role.
Okay, thank you. We have heard back from Adam clarifying his question. He said, if the general perception of an activity such as IRs was negative in prior years, was there a larger shift to the negative in the current survey? Or did the current crisis not have an amplification effect?
Well, there's more. There is more negativity in general being displayed, but the positives are holding up pretty well too. And my point on this is essentially that it's the people who are sitting on the fence that need to be convinced. So getting ahead of the situation is, I would say, going to be a very good idea. So get out there, like if you're an operator or if you have another interest, that you have more of a role in setting the agenda rather than the media. You know, as I said, I think that we currently, the way that people are thinking about things may not necessarily reflect the way that they think about it in 6 months' time or a year. So the challenge is really to make sure that if there are negative perceptions there, that they don't become cemented among those people who are convincible, rather than just sort of sit there and witness that dynamic playing out. But I think that the economic benefits of IR, I think, are going to become more relevant.
Thank you. We have a new question. How do the IR questions differ from the way are being asked in other public opinion polls? And can you speak to any variances between your results and other data out there?
No, I can really only focus on our data, but we use, we have a random sample, as I said, of 1,000 people. It's a relatively good sample. It's a nationwide sample, and we've used the same methodology year on year. So in terms of looking at our data, the most comment-worthy parts of it really are the changes year on year. So there's always going to be some differences in the way that polls are sampled, but ours is sampled in the same way that we would sample a nationwide survey for any of our clients who are large tourism operators. And the most, probably the most noteworthy parts of it are the changes in period in terms of for us to see what's going on.
Thank you. We have a question from David. How much does trust of the government play in all of this? During Fukushima, trust was lost as honest and transparent conveying of information was limited. Do most Japanese trust the information they're getting with this crisis? And how does that affect purchasing trends?
Well, I think we did have that question that addressed whether the government was giving you enough confidence to maintain your spending, and we had definitely more detractors than we had supporters on that point. So I would say that there's relatively broad-based skepticism with the government at the moment, but I think how they conduct themselves from now, I think, is going to be very important. So the perception that data was being massaged for the Olympics, I think, is something that's a widely held belief. It seems that we are getting a more frank view from the government, but how the national government and how the Tokyo government are working on, like, I'm in Tokyo, so that's what my focus is, but how the Tokyo government and the national government working together is a question. So I think from now is the opportunity for the government to show how effective they can be.
Thank you. We have a question from someone who raised their hand. It's Peter, so I'm going to unmute Peter.
Dominic, thanks for the presentation. Very, very interesting. I had one question in relation to the gaming industry and one in relation to the travel industry. In the gaming chart that you showed, if I read it right, the interest in IR for improving or helping the economies of depressed areas was quite low on the priority list. In the US, that's been one of the biggest arguments for casinos, is to help areas that are struggling with development. I get it. Is that different in Japan, or was I maybe reading that?
I think that has something to do with the proportion of the sample that come from depressed areas. If you're in Tokyo, I mean, if you're in Tokyo, I think that, that's going to be less of an issue than, let's say, if you're in Sasebo or something like that, in Kyushu. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's what drives that. But generally speaking, I think that the economic benefits are pretty well recognized.
I see. Okay. And the other one was, again, trying to read it quickly, you talked about travel for pleasure over the past few years with different countries, the United States and many other countries. Was China on that list?
I don't believe so. run back to that chart. I don't believe it was. Or it's not on the chart. I think it was on the list, but it's pretty low numbers.
Well, I mean, there's been so many Chinese tourism has been such an important thing for Japan.
Yes.
But you don't see the reverse.
I don't think the feeling's quite mutual in terms of visitation intent there. But I'll go back to our tabulations and pick up that figure here. But on this chart here, we're really looking at kind of Western-ish markets. So
Yes.
Singapore, South Korea, like advanced markets on there.
Sure.
Okay, I believe unless there are any last minute questions from anyone, we were able to answer everyone's questions today. So thank you, Dom.
Thank you. And now I'm going to pass back to Rika. So.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now, Rika.
Okay. So I want to thank everybody for attending our event, but I also want to thank the people that helped make this event possible. We have Debbie Howard of the Carter Group, together with our presenter Dominic. They're the masterminds of the topic presented today. We also have, who's not on today, Adnan Kajawa of Sky Vista Consulting, who takes care of the JSN and marketing and website for us, and kind of jack of all trades. So I definitely want to help thank him. We also have Deborah Harlow, who Peter mentioned earlier, who take care of all of our technical aspects and set up our Zoom. So thank you, Deborah. And most importantly, I want to recognize and thank our funding source that made this event possible. Thank you to the Japan Foundation, the Center for Global Partnership. As you can see on the screen, my information's up there. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me directly. To get the summary of notes of today's presentation, please, you'll see a chat from Deborah to everybody on the link to get the notes from today's presentation. Thank you very much.